It happened 2 years ago, but the memory still feels fresh, like a wound that refuses to heal. I never thought I'd become the kind of person who believes in ghosts, but I guess some experiences change you forever. It started on a crisp October night in southern Pennsylvania. My best friend Mark had this brilliant idea to visit Whispering Pines Cemetery, one of the oldest graveyards in the state. He claimed it was just for fun and that we'd get some cool photos for his Instagram. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but peer pressure's a powerful thing. Before I knew it, we were piling into his car with his girlfriend Sarah and her cousin Lily. The cemetery was tucked away in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense woods. The road leading to it was narrow, flanked by towering trees that seemed to swallow the light. When we arrived, the wrought iron gates loomed before us like the mouth of some ancient beast. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves. Mark pushed open the gate, and the hinges groaned in protest. "See, it's not so bad," he said with that cocky grin of his. Sarah and Lily giggled nervously, but I couldn't shake the unease settling in my gut. Something about the place felt wrong. We wandered deeper into the cemetery, our flashlights cutting through the inky darkness. The tombstones were weathered, their inscriptions faded and almost illegible. Some were tilted at odd angles, as if the earth itself was trying to swallow them. We stopped by a massive oak tree in the center of the graveyard, its gnarled branches twisting upward like skeletal fingers. "All right, let's do this," Mark said, pulling out his phone. He wanted us to sit in a circle around the tree and hold hands. "It's just for fun," he assured us, but I could see the doubt in Lily's eyes. She was clutching a rosary, her lips moving in silent prayer. Mark started asking questions, mocking the idea of spirits. "If anyone's here, give us a sign," he said, laughing. The wind picked up, rattling the leaves, and Sarah yelped. "It's just the wind," Mark scoffed, but his bravado was starting to crack. That's when we heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it could have been the wind. But it wasn't. The voice was unmistakable, and it wasn't any of us. "Leave," it said, barely audible but chilling to the bone. Lily started crying, begging us to go, but Mark insisted we stay. He called out again, demanding another sign. That's when the temperature plummeted. My breath came out in white puffs, and frost began to form on the grass around us. It didn't make sense. It wasn't cold enough for that. Then we saw her. A figure emerged from behind the tree, cloaked in shadow. She was wearing a tattered white dress, her long black hair matted and hanging over her face. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on tangled strings. She didn't speak, but her presence screamed malevolence. "Run," I whispered, but no one moved. We were frozen, rooted to the spot as she stepped closer. Her eyes, God, her eyes were empty voids, darker than the night itself. She raised a hand, her bony fingers pointing directly at Mark. "What do you want?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. She didn't answer, but the ground beneath us began to shift. A low, guttural moan rose from the earth as the soil around the grave started to crack. Something was coming, and it wasn't friendly. That was when the screaming started. Mark was the first to bolt, dragging Sarah behind him. Lily and I followed, but the ground seemed to move beneath our feet, making it almost impossible to run. The shadows lengthened, twisting into grotesque shapes that reached for us. I swear I could hear laughter, deep, guttural, and mocking. We made it back to the car, but the nightmare didn't end there. As Mark fumbled with the keys, the figure appeared again, standing just a few feet away. Her head tilted unnaturally to the side, and she let out a sound that was somewhere between a scream and a growl. The windows of the car fogged up, and handprints began to appear on the glass, dozens of them, pressing from the outside. "Drive!" I shouted, and Mark finally got the engine to roar to life. We tore out of there, the tires skidding on the gravel road. I looked back once, just once, and I wish I hadn't. She was standing in the middle of the road, watching us with those empty eyes, her figure slowly dissolving into the mist. For weeks after that night, strange things happened. Mark's car wouldn't start, no matter how many times he had it fixed. Sarah woke up with scratches on her arms that she couldn't explain. Lily refused to leave her house, convinced the spirit had followed her home. And me? I started seeing her in my dreams, or maybe they weren't dreams at all. She'd be standing at the foot of my bed, her head tilted, her hand reaching for me. I could feel the cold radiating from her, hear the faint whispers of "leave" echoing in my ears. I started sleeping with the lights on, but it didn't help. Nothing helped. Mark tried to go back to the cemetery a few weeks later, claiming he wanted to prove it was all in our heads. He never came back. The police found his car abandoned near the gates, the engine still running. They searched the area for days but found no sign of him. I don't know what she was or what she wanted, but I do know this. Whispering Pines Cemetery isn't just haunted, it's cursed. And if you value your life, your soul, you'll stay far, far away.
Story number 2.
It started with a dare. They always do, don't they? You hear about haunted places, laugh it off, and tell yourself it's just stories. But sometimes the stories are warnings. This time, the place was Hollow Creek Cemetery, a small, overgrown graveyard tucked behind a forgotten church in rural Georgia. Legend had it that the cemetery was cursed, guarded by an entity people called the Keeper. The Keeper wasn't just a spirit. It was something worse, something ancient. It was said to punish anyone who disrespected the dead or lingered too long. My friends and I, Jake, Melanie, and Ty, weren't superstitious. We were bored, and it was Halloween night. The perfect time to prove we weren't afraid of some urban legend. Jake, of course, was the one who suggested it. He was always the instigator, the one who pushed the rest of us into doing things we probably shouldn't. We go in, stay for an hour, and leave. Jake said as he parked his truck outside the rusted gates of Hollow Creek Cemetery. The moon hung high, casting an eerie glow over the rows of crumbling tombstones. The air was thick, the kind of oppressive humidity that made it hard to breathe. The gates creaked loudly as we pushed them open. A shiver ran down my spine, but I shrugged it off. Just nerves, I told myself. The cemetery was a tangled mess of weeds, broken markers, and gnarled trees. Some graves were so old the names had eroded away, leaving only blank, weathered stones. Jake led the way with a flashlight, his cocky attitude still intact. Melanie clung to Ty's arm, her usual bravado replaced by nervous laughter. I stayed at the back, my skin crawling as if unseen eyes were watching us. "Let's find the oldest grave," Jake said, shining his light across the rows of headstones. "That's where the Keeper's supposed to appear, right?" "Don't," Melanie said, her voice trembling. "Let's just hang out by the entrance and leave. We don't need to go deeper." But Jake ignored her. He stopped in front of a cracked headstone that leaned at a precarious angle. 1863, he read aloud. "That's pretty old." As we gathered around, a cold breeze swept through, far too chilly for the warm autumn night. "Do you feel that?" Ty asked, rubbing his arms. "Just the wind," Jake said, though his voice wasn't as confident as before. He crouched down and knocked on the headstone. "Hey, Keeper, you there? Show yourself!" "Jake, stop!" I snapped. "This isn't funny." But he didn't listen. He kept taunting, his words growing louder, more mocking. And then the flashlight flickered and died. "Damn it," Jake muttered, smacking it against his palm. Melanie screamed as something moved in the darkness, a shadow too large to be an animal, shifting between the trees. "Did you see that?" she whispered, clutching Ty's arm tighter. "Probably just a deer," Ty said, though his voice shook. But it wasn't a deer. The air changed, growing colder and heavier. The silence was deafening, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then we heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "What the hell was that?" Jake said, standing up too fast and nearly tripping over the grave. "Time to go," I said, already backing toward the gate. But when I turned, the gate was gone. The cemetery stretched endlessly in every direction, the twisted trees and graves blending into an infinite, shadowy maze. "Where's the exit?" Melanie cried, her voice breaking. "We didn't go that far," Jake yelled, spinning around in circles. But it was no use. The cemetery had changed, shifting into something unnatural. The growling came again, louder this time, accompanied by a sound like dragging chains. We huddled together, flashlights pointed in every direction. The beams of light barely penetrated the darkness, as if it were alive, swallowing everything it touched. Then we saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and skeletal, draped in tattered black robes that flowed like smoke. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a void, a swirling abyss of darkness that seemed to pull at your very soul. Chains hung from its bony hands, rattling with every step. "The Keeper," Melanie whispered, her eyes wide with terror. It raised a hand, and the growling stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. And then the voice came. Deep, guttural, and ancient, it echoed in our minds rather than our ears. "You have disturbed the sacred ground," it said. "You do not belong here." "We're sorry," I blurted out, my voice trembling. "We didn't mean to." "Silence," it commanded, and my throat seized up, the words dying before they could leave my lips. The Keeper pointed at Jake. "You mocked the dead. You will be the first." "No," Jake screamed, backing away. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean it." But it was too late. The chains shot forward, wrapping around his arms and legs. He screamed as they dragged him toward the keeper, his nails clawing at the dirt. And then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Melanie was next. She tried to run, but the ground beneath her feet opened up, revealing a yawning pit of blackness. She fell without a sound, her scream cut off as the earth closed over her. Ty and I ran, our legs moving on pure adrenaline. We didn't know where we were going, but it didn't matter. The keeper's growls echoed all around us, closing in from every direction. Ty tripped over a root, and before I could help him up, the shadows enveloped him. His screams were muffled, as if he were sinking into thick, suffocating tar. I was alone now, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The keeper appeared before me, its chains dragging across the ground. "You defiled this place," it said. "You will join them." "No," I screamed, falling to my knees. "Please, I didn't do anything." It tilted its head as if considering my plea. Then it pointed to a grave behind me, its cracked headstone glowing faintly in the darkness. "Dig," it commanded. I hesitated, but the chains rattled ominously. I crawled to the grave and began clawing at the dirt with my bare hands. The soil was cold and damp, filling my nails as I dug deeper and deeper. Finally, my fingers brushed against something hard, a wooden coffin, rotting and splintered. "Open it," the keeper said. Tears streamed down my face as I pried the lid open. Inside was me, my own lifeless body, staring back with empty, glassy eyes. "No," I whispered, backing away. "This can't be real." The keeper loomed over me. "This is your fate. You belong to the dead now." The last thing I saw was its chains wrapping around me, pulling me into the cold embrace of the grave. When I woke up, it was daylight. I was lying just outside the cemetery gates, my hands covered in dirt, my clothes torn and soaked with dew. Jake, Melanie, and Ty were gone, their names etched into new headstones that hadn't been there the night before. I've never gone back to Hollow Creek Cemetery, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the rattling of chains and the low growl of the keeper, and I know it's only a matter of time before it comes to claim me.
Story number 3.
It began with an old house at the edge of town, the kind everyone in my small Kentucky hometown whispered about, but no one dared to approach. The Winchester estate had been abandoned for decades, its windows dark and lifeless, its once grand exterior now a decaying shell. But it wasn't just the disrepair that kept people away. There were stories of screams in the night, shadows moving in the windows, and an ominous red glow that sometimes flickered from the attic. I never believed in any of it, of course. Ghost stories were for kids, but then my brother David went missing. It happened on a warm summer evening. He'd gone out with his friends, promising to be back before dark. When he didn't return, panic set in. We searched the entire town, but there was no sign of him. Then someone mentioned the Winchester estate. They were talking about going there, his friend Lisa admitted, tears streaming down her face. I told him not to, but he wouldn't listen. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a flashlight and a crowbar and headed straight for the house. My parents begged me to wait for the police, but I couldn't. David was my little brother, and if he was in that house, I wasn't going to leave him. The air grew heavy as I approached the estate, the kind of oppressive stillness that makes your skin crawl. The gate hung crooked on rusted hinges, and the overgrown path to the front door was littered with dead leaves and broken branches. The house loomed before me, its shadow stretching long and foreboding in the fading light. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. It was ice cold to the touch, sending a shiver up my spine. When I finally pushed it open, the door creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty halls. The inside was worse than I imagined. The air was stale and heavy, thick with the scent of rot. The wallpaper peeled in long, curling strips, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. Cobwebs clung to every corner, and strange markings were etched into the walls, symbols I didn't recognize. "David?" I called, my voice trembling. There was no answer, just the distant creak of wood settling. I moved deeper into the house, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Every step felt wrong, as if the house itself were watching me. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision, and I swore I heard whispers, soft, almost imperceptible, but there. They seemed to grow louder the further I went, forming words I couldn't quite understand. The staircase was the worst. The banister was splintered, and the steps sagged beneath my weight. As I climbed, I felt a sudden chill, as if something cold had brushed against my arm. I whipped around, shining my flashlight behind me, but there was nothing there. When I reached the second floor, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. I moved down the hallway, checking each room. Most were empty, filled only with broken furniture and dust. But then I came to the last door. It was slightly ajar, and a faint red light seeped through the crack. My heart pounded as I pushed it open. Inside was the attic staircase, a narrow, spiraling set of steps that seemed to disappear into the glow above. I climbed slowly, my hand gripping the railing so tightly my knuckles turned white. The light grew brighter with each step, pulsing like a heartbeat. When I reached the top, I saw him. David was standing in the center of the attic, his back to me. He was surrounded by candles, arranged in a strange, intricate pattern. Their flames burned unnaturally high, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. The red light emanated from a large, circular symbol carved into the floor beneath him. It looked old, ancient, and it thrummed with a strange, otherworldly energy. "David!" I shouted, rushing toward him. But he didn't move. He just stood there, his head tilted at an odd angle, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. When I reached him, I grabbed his shoulder and turned him around. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his lips moved silently, forming words that made no sense. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his skin was ice cold. "David, it's me! Snap out of it!" I shook him, but he didn't respond. That's when I heard it, the sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. A low, guttural growl coming from behind me. Slowly, I turned my head. In the corner of the attic, crouched like some grotesque spider, was a figure. It was human-shaped but twisted, its limbs impossibly long and thin. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its face was a nightmare. Hollow eyes burned with an unnatural fire, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin filled with needle-like teeth. It moved toward us with an unnatural, jerky gait, its limbs bending in ways that defied logic. I froze, paralyzed by terror, as it crept closer. Then David spoke. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered, his voice layered with something dark and inhuman. "It doesn't want you here." "David, please," I begged, shaking him harder. "We have to get out of here." But he didn't move. The creature was almost upon us now, its breath hot and rancid against my face. Desperate, I grabbed David and pulled with all my strength. He screamed, a blood-curdling, otherworldly sound that didn't belong to him, as I dragged him out of the circle. The candles extinguished instantly, plunging the attic into darkness. I didn't stop. I carried him down the stairs, through the hallway, and out the front door, my legs moving on pure adrenaline. The air outside was like a slap to the face, crisp and cold, and I didn't stop running until we were far from the house. David collapsed onto the ground, unconscious but alive. I called the police, but when they arrived, the house was different. The markings on the walls were gone, the attic was empty, and the red glow was nowhere to be found. David doesn't talk about what happened that night. He barely speaks at all anymore. He won't leave the house, and he won't look in mirrors. Sometimes late at night, I hear him whispering to himself, the same strange words he said in the attic. And sometimes I feel it too, the cold brush of air against my arm, the faint sound of growling just outside my window. I don't know what we disturbed in that house, but I know it's not over. It's watching, waiting, and one day it will come back for us.
Story number 4.
There's a stretch of road outside of town known as Widow's Hollow. Everyone in the area has heard the stories. Cars breaking down, strange sightings, people disappearing. But no one knows the full truth. I didn't believe any of it, of course. Not until I drove through it myself. It was late November, and I was driving back from a friend's house. The shortcut through Widow's Hollow was supposed to save me 20 minutes, and it was already nearing midnight. The road was empty, flanked by dense, skeletal trees that seemed to press in closer the further I went. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. It wasn't just the absence of cars or animals, it was total silence. Even the hum of my car engine felt muted, swallowed by the oppressive stillness. My headlights illuminated the cracked asphalt ahead, but the darkness beyond seemed thicker, almost alive. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just an old road with a creepy reputation. Still, I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. About 5 miles in, I saw her. A figure standing on the side of the road, shrouded in shadow. She was wearing a long black dress that fluttered slightly, even though there was no wind. Her face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and her posture was unnaturally still. I slowed down, my hands tightening on the wheel. I couldn't see her face, but something about her felt wrong. My instincts screamed at me to keep driving, but my curiosity got the better of me. I rolled down the window just a crack. "Do you need help?" I called out, my voice shaky. She didn't respond. She didn't move. Ma'am? I tried again. Still nothing. Just as I was about to give up and drive away, she tilted her head ever so slightly, her hat casting an even darker shadow over her face. I don't know why, but the gesture sent a jolt of fear through me. I slammed the window shut and hit the gas, my tires screeching as I sped past her. In my rearview mirror, I saw her turn to watch me go, her head twisting at an unnatural angle. The road stretched endlessly before me, but something was wrong. No matter how far I drove, the trees looked the same, tall, skeletal, and clawing at the sky. My gas gauge began to dip alarmingly fast, even though I'd filled up earlier that day. That's when the radio turned on by itself. Static hissed through the speakers, and then, faintly, I heard a woman's voice. It was soft, almost a whisper, but it sent chills through me. "Turn back," she said, the words crackling through the static. "Nope," I muttered, reaching to turn the radio off. But the knob wouldn't budge. The static grew louder, the voice repeating over and over, "Turn back, turn back, turn back." I slammed my fist against the dashboard and the radio finally cut out. But the relief was short-lived. Ahead of me, in the middle of the road, was the woman again. She was closer now, her hat gone, revealing a pale, gaunt face with hollow, black eyes. Her lips twisted into a grotesque smile as I hit the brakes, the car skidding to a halt just feet away from her. I honked the horn, my heart pounding. "Get out of the way!" I shouted. She raised a hand, pointing toward the woods. Her fingers were long and thin, the skin stretched tightly over them. Then, without warning, she dissolved into a cloud of black smoke that drifted into the trees. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I slammed the gas pedal and tore down the road, the tires kicking up gravel. My headlights flickered, and the air inside the car grew icy cold. I felt something behind me, a presence so heavy it made it hard to breathe. I glanced in the rearview mirror and nearly drove off the road. She was in the back seat. Her face was inches from mine, her hollow eyes boring into me. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. I screamed, jerking the wheel and swerving wildly. When I looked again, she was gone. The road twisted and turned in ways I didn't remember, as if it were shifting beneath me. The trees leaned in closer, their branches scraping against the sides of the car like fingernails. The gas gauge was now on empty, but the car kept moving, as if something else were propelling it forward. I came to a clearing, and in the middle of it was a house. It was old and crumbling, its windows dark and broken. The car stopped abruptly, the engine sputtering and dying. The silence returned, heavier than before. I didn't want to get out, but I had no choice. My phone had no signal, and the keys wouldn't turn in the ignition. The house seemed to beckon me, its door slightly ajar. As I approached, the air grew colder, and I could hear faint whispers. They were coming from the house, but they weren't inviting. They were pleading. "Don't. Leave. Don't go inside." I should have listened, but something compelled me forward, an unseen force pulling me toward the door. Inside, the house was worse than I imagined. The walls were covered in strange, dark stains, and the floor was littered with broken furniture and debris. The whispers grew louder, mingling with the faint sound of sobbing. In the corner of the living room stood a mirror, its surface cracked and fogged. As I approached, the sobbing stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. I peered into the glass and saw not my reflection, but the woman. She was smiling, her black eyes fixed on me. Her lips moved, and this time I understood her words. "You shouldn't have come." The room behind me shifted in the mirror, revealing a crowd of shadowy figures. They moved closer, their hands outstretched. When I turned around, they were there. Dozens of them, their hollow faces watching me, their whispers blending into a cacophony of despair. I ran. I don't remember how I got out of the house or back to the road, but I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. A passing truck driver found me at sunrise, lying in the middle of the road, my clothes torn and my face pale as death. I told the police everything, but they found no trace of the woman or the house. They said Widow's Hollow was just an old road, nothing more. But I know the truth. Something lives there, something ancient and angry. And every night, I hear her voice in my dreams whispering the same words, "Turn back."
Story number 5.
It started with a phone call. I was sitting alone in my small apartment, the rain tapping insistently against the windows. The night was quiet, except for the hum of my ceiling fan, and I was halfway through a glass of wine when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Normally I wouldn't answer, but something compelled me to. Maybe it was boredom or the slight buzz from the wine, but I swiped to pick it up. "Hello?" At first, there was silence, but then I heard it, a faint, raspy whisper. "Help me." I froze, my hand tightening around the phone. The voice was weak, almost drowned out by a strange crackling sound. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was no answer, just the same whisper, repeating the plea. "Help me." I hung up, my heart pounding. It was probably just a prank, I told myself. People with nothing better to do on a rainy night. But as I set the phone down, it buzzed again. Unknown number. My stomach dropped. This time I let it ring. It stopped after the third buzz, but then my landline rang. Now, this was strange. No one ever called my landline. It was an old rotary phone I'd found at an estate sale, purely decorative, or so I thought. My hands trembled as I picked up the receiver. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "You shouldn't have answered," the voice rasped, and the line went dead. I slammed the receiver down, my chest heaving. The air in the room felt heavier, oppressive, like the walls were closing in. I checked the locks on my door and windows, then sat on the couch, clutching my phone like a lifeline. Minutes passed, then hours, but the phone didn't ring again. I convinced myself it was over, just a weird coincidence or some tech glitch. But then the scratching started. It came from inside the walls, faint at first, like mice scurrying. But it grew louder, more deliberate, until it sounded like fingernails clawing at the plaster. I pressed my ear to the wall, my breath shallow. "Help me," the voice whispered again, this time so close it felt like it was coming from inside my skull. I stumbled back, tripping over the coffee table and falling hard onto the floor. The scratching stopped, replaced by a single heavy thud that echoed through the apartment. It came from the bedroom. I didn't want to go, but something, curiosity, fear, or sheer stupidity, pushed me to my feet. I grabbed a kitchen knife, my hand shaking as I crept toward the bedroom door. It was ajar, the faint glow of my bedside lamp spilling out into the hallway. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely a whisper. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the room. Everything looked normal. The bed, the dresser, the pile of laundry I'd been ignoring for days. But then I saw it. The closet door was open, just a crack, and from the darkness inside, two glowing eyes stared back at me. They weren't human. Too large, too reflective, like the eyes of a predator. I froze, unable to move or breathe. The thing in the closet let out a low, guttural growl, and then it spoke. Its voice layered and inhuman. "You let me in." The lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. My heart raced as I backed away, gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles ached. The closet door creaked open wider, and I heard the sound of something heavy stepping onto the floor. In the dim light from the hallway, I saw it, tall, hunched, with limbs too long and a face that was more shadow than flesh. Its mouth stretched into a grin that revealed jagged, yellowed teeth, and its eyes burned like embers. I screamed, throwing the knife as hard as I could. It sailed past the creature, embedding itself in the wall. The thing didn't flinch. It just stood there, grinning, as if mocking me. I turned and ran, slamming the bedroom door behind me. The locks wouldn't hold. I knew that. But adrenaline pushed me forward. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the front door, yanking it open. The hallway outside was wrong. It wasn't the familiar corridor of my apartment building. Instead, it stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with doors that looked warped and decayed. The air smelled of mildew and rot, and the dim, flickering light from the overhead fixtures cast strange dancing shadows. I had no choice but to move forward. Every step felt heavier, like the floor was trying to pull me down. The doors on either side seemed to lean toward me, their handles rattling as if something inside was trying to get out. I kept walking, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Then I heard it, the soft patter of footsteps behind me. I turned, but there was nothing there. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and the air grew colder. "Help me." The voice came again, louder this time, echoing through the endless hallway. I broke into a run, my bare feet slapping against the cold, damp floor. The hallway stretched on forever, no exit in sight. The footsteps behind me turned into a sprint, accompanied by that same guttural growl. I didn't dare look back. Finally, I saw it. A single door at the end of the hall, glowing faintly. I reached it just as the growling creature behind me let out an ear-piercing scream. I flung the door open and stumbled through, slamming it shut behind me. I was back in my apartment. The lights were on, the rain still tapping against the windows. Everything looked normal, but I didn't feel safe. I locked the door, barricading it with the couch and every heavy piece of furniture I could find. That was 2 days ago. I haven't slept. I haven't left. Every night, the scratching starts again, louder and more insistent. The phone rings, but I don't answer. I know who it is. This apartment feels smaller now, like the walls are closing in. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I see movement, shadows that don't belong. And at night, when the rain is quiet and the scratching stops, I hear it whispering my name. I know it's still here, waiting, watching, and it's only a matter of time before it gets in again.
Story number 6.
It started as a dare, one of those reckless challenges whispered between friends during a late-night bonfire. The dare was simple. Spend 1 hour inside the abandoned Willow Creek Sanitarium, a crumbling relic that had loomed over our small town for decades. It was said to be haunted by the souls of its patients, left behind when the institution shut down under mysterious circumstances in the 1960s. Most people avoided it, but we were young and stupid, eager to prove our bravery. It was supposed to be me, my best friend Jason, and our group of 5 others. But when the night came, excuses piled up, and suddenly it was just Jason and me standing at the rusted gates of the sanitarium. The building was a shadowy monolith, its windows shattered and dark. The air around it felt colder, and the wind carried an eerie whistle as it passed through the broken panes. Jason laughed nervously, his flashlight casting long, jittery beams against the peeling facade. 1 hour, he said, forcing a grin. We'll go in, take some pictures for proof, and get the hell out. I nodded, though my gut was already screaming at me to leave. But I couldn't back out now, not with Jason watching. Together, we pushed open the heavy front doors, the creak echoing like a scream. The smell hit us first, stale air mixed with mildew and something faintly metallic. The lobby was a ruin of overturned furniture, broken glass, and graffiti. A receptionist's desk sat in the corner, its surface carved with crude messages and symbols. A tattered patient intake log lay open, its pages yellowed and brittle. Jason shone his flashlight down the main hallway, its walls lined with peeling paint and rusted doors. Creepy, but not exactly terrifying, he said, his voice shaky. We ventured deeper, our footsteps echoing ominously. Every so often we'd stop to take pictures, like the flash momentarily illuminating the decay. The deeper we went, the more the air seemed to thicken, as if the building itself didn't want us there. About 20 minutes in, we reached the heart of the sanitarium, the central ward. The doors to the patient rooms hung open, revealing small, cramped spaces with rusted beds and crumbling walls. Jason wandered into one, snapping pictures and narrating mockingly for his phone's camera. This is where the haunted stuff supposedly happened, he said. Look, the walls are practically bleeding terror. He laughed, but it sounded forced. I stayed in the hallway, unease growing with every passing second. That's when I noticed the temperature drop. My breath puffed out in white clouds and goosebumps prickled my skin. Jason, I called, do you feel that? What? His voice echoed back, distant, though he hadn't gone far. It's freezing in here. Jason stepped out of the room and light his flashlight casting long shadows. Yeah, weird. Maybe the insulation's totally shot. But then we heard it, a soft, distant sound like the murmur of voices. It wasn't coming from either of us. We froze, exchanging a nervous glance. Hello? Jason called out. His voice bounced down the hallway, but no one answered. Maybe we should. The sound came again, louder this time. It wasn't murmuring anymore. It was crying, soft, anguished sobs echoing through the darkness. Jason's bravado melted away as his eyes widened. Let's go, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We turned to leave, but the moment we did, a loud crash echoed from the end of the hall. It sounded like metal slamming against metal. I spun around, my flashlight trembling as I pointed it toward the source. Who's there? I shouted, though I wasn't sure I wanted an answer. The beam of light landed on the farthest door, the only one that was still intact. Its metal surface shuddered as if something was pounding on it from the other side. Jason grabbed my arm. We're leaving. Now. But as we turned to flee, every door in the hallway slammed shut at once. The sound was deafening, the force shaking the walls. My heart hammered in my chest as I shone the flashlight down the row of doors. They were all closed, except for one. The farthest door, the one that had been shaking moments before. Now it stood open, the darkness inside beckoning. Nope, Jason said, pulling me toward the exit. But as we moved, the sobbing grew louder, now joined by a faint metallic scraping sound, like nails dragging against a chalkboard. We broke into a run, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly. No matter how far we ran, the lobby didn't appear. My flashlight began to flicker, plunging us into brief pockets of darkness. I could hear Jason's panicked breathing beside me, matching my own. Then the lights went out completely. I screamed, fumbling to turn the flashlight back on. When it finally flickered to life, Jason was gone. "Jason!" I shouted, my voice cracking. I spun in every direction, the beam of light catching only empty, decayed hallways. The sobbing had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. And then, behind me, a voice. "Help me." I whipped around, my flashlight trembling as I pointed it down the hall. Jason stood there, but something was wrong. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and his eyes, they weren't his eyes. They were black, bottomless pits that seemed to suck the light from the room. "Jason?" I whispered. He smiled, a slow, unsettling grin that stretched too wide. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice layered with something deeper, something inhuman. I stumbled backward, my flashlight dropping and rolling across the floor. In the dim light, I saw them. Shadows slithering along the walls, dozens of them, moving closer. Their shapes were wrong, their limbs too long, their faces featureless. I grabbed the flashlight and bolted, my lungs burning as I ran blindly through the labyrinthine halls. The shadows followed, their whispers filling my ears. "You can't leave," they hissed. "You're ours now." I don't know how I found the lobby, but suddenly I was there, the front doors just a few feet away. I threw myself at them, pulling with all my strength. They wouldn't budge. Behind me, the whispers grew louder, the air thick with cold. And then Jason's voice. "Wait, don't leave me." I turned, and there he was, standing just a few feet away. He looked normal now, his eyes wide with fear. "Please," he begged, "don't leave me here." For a moment I hesitated, but then his expression changed, his mouth curling into that same unnatural grin. "You'll come back," he said, his voice twisting into something guttural and alien. The doors flew open, and I stumbled out into the night. Rain poured down, soaking me as I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. When I looked back, the sanitarium was dark and silent, its doors firmly shut. Jason was never found. The police searched the building but found no trace of him or anyone else. They said it was just an old, abandoned structure, nothing more. But I know what I saw. And at night, when I'm alone, I hear it. The faint sound of sobbing echoing from somewhere just beyond the walls.
Story number 7.
It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway. My friends and I had rented a remote cabin deep in the woods of West Virginia, far away from the noise and chaos of the city. We wanted quiet, peace, and maybe a little adventure. What we got was something else entirely. The cabin was picturesque during the day, wooden beams, a cozy fireplace, and a wraparound porch overlooking the dense forest. But as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the place took on a different aura. The shadows in the trees grew longer, darker, almost alive, and the chirping of birds was replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence. The first night started normally enough. We cooked dinner, played cards, and told stupid ghost stories around the fire. We laughed at how ridiculous some of them were. Urban legends about ghost hitchhikers and haunted dolls. But then, as the fire burned low and the night grew colder, Jason, always the one to push boundaries, suggested we try a local ritual he'd read about online. "Have you heard of the Hollow Man?" he asked, a mischievous glint in his eyes. We hadn't, so he explained. "Legend says there's a spirit in these woods. If you call his name 3 times while looking into a mirror, he shows up. People say he's unfinished, no face, no features, just a hollow body that mimics your voice." "Sounds like Bloody Mary," I said, rolling my eyes. "Yeah," said Lisa, one of the more skeptical members of the group. "This is obviously fake," Jason shrugged. "Maybe. But don't you want to find out?" No one wanted to be the buzzkill, so we played along. Jason found a small mirror in one of the cabin's bedrooms, and we gathered around it in the living room. The fire cast flickering shadows on the walls, and the mirror reflected all our nervous faces. "All right," Jason said, holding the mirror steady. "Let's call him." We hesitated, but Jason began the chant. "Hollow Man! Hollow Man! Hollow Man!" For a moment, nothing happened. The room was silent except for the crackle of the fire. Then the lights flickered, and a cold breeze swept through the cabin, making the flames dance wildly. The air felt heavier, and my stomach twisted in sudden unease. Lisa laughed nervously. "Okay, very funny. Who left a window open?" "No one," Jason said, his voice quieter now. "That wasn't me." We all looked around, but the windows were shut tight. The door was locked. There was no logical explanation for the sudden chill. Then the mirror in Jason's hands fogged over, as if someone had breathed on it from the other side. A single word appeared, written in the condensation. Leave. Lisa screamed, and Jason dropped the mirror, shattering it on the hardwood floor. We all stood frozen, staring at the shards, waiting for something else to happen. But the room was quiet again, the oppressive chill fading as quickly as it had come. That's enough, I said, my voice shaking. No more stupid games. Everyone agreed, though Jason looked disappointed. We cleaned up the broken mirror and tried to brush off what happened as a freak coincidence. But the unease lingered, and none of us slept well that night. The next morning, things got worse. We woke to find strange marks on the cabin walls, long, jagged scratches that hadn't been there the night before. At first, we thought it might have been an animal, but the scratches were too precise, too deliberate. They formed strange, swirling patterns like symbols or runes. I told you this was a bad idea, Lisa said, glaring at Jason. He held up his hands defensively. How was I supposed to know this would happen? It's just a stupid legend. But it didn't feel stupid anymore. The marks weren't the only thing. The air inside the cabin felt wrong, like it was pressing down on us, suffocating. And then there were the whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. By the afternoon, we decided to leave. But when we packed our bags and tried to start the car, the engine wouldn't turn over. Jason tried everything, but it was like the vehicle had died overnight. Our phones had no signal, and the nearest town was miles away through dense, unfamiliar woods. Panic set in. Lisa suggested we hike to find help, but no one wanted to leave the safety of the cabin. Not that it felt particularly safe anymore. As night fell, the whispers grew louder. They were still unintelligible, but now they seemed to come with a rhythm, like a chant. We tried to drown them out with music and conversation, but nothing worked. The fire wouldn't stay lit, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow darker, deeper, like they were watching us. Around midnight, we heard it, a low, guttural scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the porch. I peeked out the window, but there was nothing there. The sound moved, circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. "What is that?" Lisa whispered, clutching a blanket around her shoulders. No one answered. Jason grabbed a kitchen knife, though I doubted it would do much good. The scraping stopped, replaced by a series of soft knocks. 3 spaced evenly on the front door. Knock, knock, knock. "Don't open it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Jason nodded, backing away from the door. The knocking continued, louder now, more insistent. And then it stopped. We waited, holding our breath, but the silence was worse than the noise. The air grew colder again, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. They were inside now, circling us, filling the room. "Look!" Lisa shouted, pointing at the far wall. The shadows were moving, coalescing into a tall, human-like figure. Its body was dark and featureless, like a silhouette cut from the fabric of reality, and its face, there was nothing there. Just a hollow void, where its features should have been. It stepped forward, its movements unnaturally smooth, almost fluid. As it came closer, it began to speak, mimicking our voices in a distorted, overlapping cacophony. "Help me," it said, in a perfect imitation of Lisa's voice. "Don't leave me," it added, this time in mine. Jason lunged at it with the knife, but the blade passed through it like smoke. The hollow man tilted its head as if amused, then reached out with one shadowy hand. The lights exploded, plunging us into total darkness. I heard Jason scream, followed by a sickening thud. Lisa was crying, her sobs blending with the creature's distorted whispers. I don't know how I got out. One moment, I was in the cabin, and the next, I was stumbling through the woods, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. The whispers followed me, growing fainter as I ran until they finally disappeared. By the time I reached the nearest road, the sun was rising. A passing car stopped, and the driver took me to the police. When they searched the cabin, they found nothing. No scratches on the walls, no signs of struggle. Jason and Lisa were gone as if they'd never existed. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. The hollow man's voice, mimicking mine, whispering from the shadows.
Story number 8.
The wind howled as I drove down the desolate highway, a black ribbon cutting through endless miles of forest. I had been driving for hours, my eyes gritty with exhaustion. My GPS had stopped working miles ago, and my phone had no signal. I told myself I'd find a motel soon, but the stretch of road seemed unending, swallowed by the night. Then I saw it, a flickering neon sign in the distance. Echo Pines Motel. Relief flooded through me as I pulled into the gravel lot. The building was old, a single-story structure with peeling paint and cracked windows. A faint light glowed in the office window, the word vacancy buzzing weakly above the door. Inside, the clerk greeted me with an odd smile. He was an older man with thinning hair and a weathered face. His eyes seemed to linger on me a moment too long. "Late to be traveling," he said, sliding a key across the counter. The tag read room 6. "Checkout's at 8. Sleep tight." I nodded, muttered a thanks, and headed to the room. The air smelled damp, and the light bulb in the overhead fixture buzzed faintly. The room was as run down as the exterior, but I was too tired to care. I locked the door, dropped my bag by the bed, and collapsed onto the lumpy mattress. I woke up to the sound of voices. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but as I came fully awake, I realized they were real. Faint murmurs drifting through the thin walls. I glanced at the clock. 3:12 a.m. The voices grew louder, clearer. It sounded like a man and a woman arguing in the room next door. Their words were muffled, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, desperate. I considered banging on the wall, but something held me back. There was an edge to their voices, a rawness that sent chills up my spine. I tried to ignore it, pulling the scratchy blanket over my head, but then I heard something else. A sharp, metallic crash, followed by a woman's scream. My heart jumped into my throat. I sat up, debating what to do. Should I call the police? But my phone still had no signal, and the office was too far to walk to in the dark. Gathering my courage, I decided to check it out. The hallway outside my room was dimly lit, the carpet worn thin. I approached room 7, the source of the commotion, and pressed my ear to the door. The argument had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. "Hello?" I called softly. No answer. The door wasn't fully closed. It creaked open at my touch, revealing a room identical to mine, but empty. The bed was unmade, the TV on but showing static. A chair lay overturned near the window, and the air was thick with the coppery scent of blood. My pulse quickened as I stepped inside. "Is anyone here?" I whispered. Then I saw it. A smear of blood leading from the bed to the bathroom. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see the edge of a mirror, its surface fogged as if someone had just taken a shower. I inched closer, every instinct screaming at me to run. The bathroom light flickered, casting shadows that seemed to writhe like living things. When I finally pushed the door open, my stomach lurched. The tub was full of water, dark and murky, and floating in it was a woman's body. Her hair fanned out around her pale face, her eyes wide open and staring at nothing. Her lips were frozen in a silent scream, her neck marred by deep, violent gashes. I stumbled back, my breath coming in panicked gasps. The room seemed to spin, the air growing colder. Then I heard it again. The voices, this time directly behind me. "Why did you do this to me?" a woman's voice whispered, trembling with rage. I turned, but no one was there. The room was empty. The bathroom door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. I grabbed the handle and yanked it open, but the bathroom was empty now. The tub was dry, the bloodstains gone. It was as if nothing had happened. I fled back to my room, locking the door and shoving a chair under the handle for good measure. My hands shook as I tried to make sense of what I had seen. Was I hallucinating? Dreaming? Sleep was impossible, so I sat on the bed listening to the silence. Hours passed, and just when I started to think I might have imagined everything, the voices returned. They were louder this time, more distinct. I could hear the woman crying, pleading, "Please, don't do this." And then the man, his voice low and cold, "You brought this on yourself." I couldn't take it anymore. I threw open my door and stormed into the hallway, determined to confront whoever was causing this nightmare. But the hallway was empty, the other doors closed. The voices seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, echoing down the hall. I followed them, drawn toward the office at the far end of the building. The neon vacancy sign flickered through the window as I pushed the door open. The clerk was gone, but the desk was littered with papers. Among them was an old newspaper, its edges yellowed with age. The headline made my blood run cold. "Double murder at Echo Pines Motel. Woman found dead in room 7." The article detailed a gruesome crime from 30 years ago. A couple had checked in late one night. The man, in a fit of jealousy, had killed his girlfriend in the bathtub before hanging himself in the room. Guests and staff reported strange occurrences in the years that followed, unexplained noises, ghostly apparitions, and objects moving on their own. I felt sick. The room began to spin, and I stumbled back, knocking over a stack of papers. Beneath them was a guest ledger, its pages filled with names. My name was the last one written, but beneath it, 2 more names appeared, faint and faded as if written in invisible ink. The The names of the couple from the article. The voices swelled around me, overlapping, a cacophony of anger and despair. The door slammed shut and the lights flickered wildly. I backed into the corner, clutching the ledger like a talisman. "You shouldn't be here," a voice whispered in my ear. I spun around, but no one was there. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the room seemed to shift and crawl toward me. Then I saw them, two figures standing in the doorway. The man was tall, his face twisted in a snarl. The woman stood behind him, her eyes empty, her throat slashed open. "You took everything from me," the man growled, stepping closer. "Now you'll pay." The woman reached out, her fingers icy cold as they brushed my arm. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the man's angry growls. I bolted, shoving past them and out into the night. The forest seemed darker than before, the motel a looming silhouette against the black sky. I didn't stop running until I reached the highway, where a truck driver finally picked me up. When I told the police, they found nothing. No blood, no ledger, no clerk. Room 7 was spotless, as if it had been untouched for decades. I never went back. But sometimes late at night, I hear them, the man's growls and the woman's pleas, echoing in the corners of my mind. And I know I'll never truly escape Echo Pines Motel.
Story number 9.
The town of Black Hollow was quiet that autumn, blanketed by the kind of stillness that came before something terrible. Its outskirts were dotted with dilapidated houses and one infamous property, the Parson Estate. Nobody in town went near it. Kids dared each other to touch its wrought iron gate, but even the bravest never stayed long. The house had a reputation, not just for being haunted, but for being malevolent. I didn't believe in ghosts, at least not until I spent a night there. It started with a bet. I was new in town, a reporter chasing a story on the most haunted places in America. Locals warned me about Parson Estate, spinning tales of people who'd gone in and never come out. The bravest dared me to last one night inside. Just a bunch of tall tales, I told myself as I crossed the threshold that evening. The house loomed against the twilight sky, its once grand facade now cracked and sagging. Windows glinted like dead eyes, reflecting the last light of the sun. Inside, the air was thick, stale, and smelled faintly of mildew. Dust covered everything: broken furniture, shattered picture frames, and long, dry flower vases. I set up camp in the living room, armed with a flashlight, a notebook, and a thermos of coffee. My goal was to debunk the myths and write about the town's superstitions. At first, the house was just quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that seemed to press against your ears. Around 10 p.m., the noises began. A faint creak echoed from upstairs, followed by what sounded like soft footsteps. I froze, listening intently. "Probably just the old woods settling," I whispered to myself, trying to stay rational. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, just on the edge of hearing. I couldn't make out the words, but they were coming from the hallway. My flashlight flickered as I turned toward the sound, the beam cutting through the shadows. The whispers stopped abruptly, as if I'd interrupted a private conversation. "Hello?" My voice echoed in the cavernous space. No answer. I chalked it up to my imagination and returned to my notes. But a cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing the small candle I'd lit. My breath misted in the air, and the temperature dropped sharply. The whispers returned, louder now, circling the room. "Get out," they hissed, the words layered with different voices, men, women, even children. My hands shook as I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the hallway again. This time, I wasn't alone. A figure stood at the far end, partially obscured by shadows. It was tall, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. The edges of its form flickered, as if it wasn't entirely solid. I couldn't make out its face, only its eyes, two hollow pits that seemed to drink in the light. Every instinct told me to run, but I couldn't move. The figure started toward me, its movements jerky, unnatural. The floorboards creaked with each step, and the whispers grew into a deafening roar. I stumbled backward, my flashlight slipping from my grasp and rolling across the floor. The beam landed on the figure's face, and I wished it hadn't. Its mouth was a gaping black hole, stretching far wider than humanly possible. As it opened, the whispers turned into a guttural scream, raw and inhuman. The air around me felt heavy, suffocating, like I was being pulled underwater. I don't know how I found the strength to move, but I bolted for the front door. It wouldn't budge. No matter how hard I pulled, it felt like something on the other side was holding it shut. The figure was closer now, just feet away. Its outstretched hand was impossibly long, the fingers curling and uncurling like a spider's legs. I screamed, throwing myself against the door with all my strength. It flew open suddenly, and I tumbled onto the porch. The air outside was crisp, the oppressive weight gone. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not stopping until I reached my car. My heart pounded as I sped away, the house shrinking in my rearview mirror. But it wasn't over. When I got home, I locked every door and window, double-checking them twice. My hands still shook as I made tea, trying to calm my nerves. I told myself it was just my imagination. The house was creepy, sure, but it couldn't have been real. Could it? I glanced at my notebook lying open on the coffee table. The last thing I'd written was still there. A description of the house, its eerie atmosphere. But beneath my words, something new had appeared. You can't escape. The words were scrawled in jagged, looping handwriting that wasn't mine. I stared at them, the room spinning around me. Then the lights flickered. A shadow passed across the room, though nothing was there. The whispers returned, faint but unmistakable. "Get out!" they hissed again, as if mocking me. The temperature dropped sharply, and my breath misted once more. I turned toward the hallway and saw it, the same figure from the house, standing just beyond the doorway. I fled that night, leaving everything behind. I never returned to Black Hollow, and I certainly never went near the Parson estate again. But sometimes in the dead of night, I still hear the whispers, and I know it's still watching.